everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. My name is Ashlen Hilliard, and I am presenting today with Dr. Cyndi Matthews. And I'm so excited that she and I are presenting together. This is something that we've actually been looking forward to. And when I approached her with some ideas for this presentation, she was just so willing and above and beyond to get into it. And so I'm very grateful that you were willing to present with me today, Cyndi. Thank you so much for all the work you put into this presentation.
Well, thank you, Ashlen, for inviting me. This was so exciting when you proposed this, and when we got talking about it, it was like, oh, this is what I love to do. So
yeah,
thank you for inviting me. This is awesome.
Yeah, of course. Today we're going to be exploring. Oh, she jumped ahead. She's excited.
Oh, there we go. There we go. You go. I get very excited.
She's excited. She was excited. Before I even read the title, she was like, we got to jump ahead. Today we'll be exploring healthy relationships for LGBTQA plus individuals after leaving the cult. So why are we interested in this topic? I'll first introduce myself, and then I'll let Cyndi introduce herself. I'm Director of Events currently for the International Cultic Studies Association. I am a researcher. I just graduated with my MSc in the psychology of coercive control. And I have been doing more intervention work, cult intervention work. Pat Ryan and Joe Kelly have been my mentors, and I've been doing more consultations with families. So I guess I wear many hats, so to speak. I was also raised in a high intensity faith group, high demand religious organization. I'd like to say, in terms of my positionality, I put the B in LGBTQA plus, but when I was in the group, I also used to say, I like to put the fun in fundy. You know, I like to put the fun in fundamentalist. So I hope to still bring that energy today to this presentation. My MSc dissertation was focused on the relationship between reproductive coercion, psychologically abusive environments, and the extent of group identity, and a sample of those who've left cultic groups. I'm an intersectional feminist. I am very strongly an advocate for reproductive rights, and that's something that I focused on. And I'll be mentioning a little bit of that throughout this presentation when applicable. So Cyndi, would you like to introduce?
Awesome. Great introduction. So I am a counselor educator. I teach at a university, and I'm also a licensed professional counselor. But at the same time, I'm also a researcher. I love to research, and like for each to inform the other. As a researcher, inform my counseling, and that informs my teaching, and just continue with this triangle. My research is mostly to do with former cult members, SGAs, MGAs. I was born and raised in a cult, also known as a high intensity faith group. I was there for 43 years. And some of the reasons that I left was because of the church's, I'm going to put that in quote, church's position on LGBTQ individuals. Also I am also a feminist. And so I was always told, you come on too strong, you're too much, you need to be submissive. And as a feminist, you really couldn't stay and be healthy. I found myself very angry. And also because of their position on people of color. And there were there were so many different issues, but one of the big ones was actually their position on LGBTQ individuals. Yes, I was raised in a cult, and I am an ally who works with LGBTQ individuals. My dissertation was on people born and raised in cults and how to counsel with and work with. And I found as I was doing my research, there is such intense pain and trauma that occurs for people born and raised, but it was additional for those who identified as LGBTQIA. And so I always said, I need to go back and research that. And I've done several studies on it now. And I also have 2 children who identify as queer. So
today, like I mentioned, we'll be exploring healthy relationships, emphasis on the healthy relationships for LGBTQA plus individuals after leaving the cult. I want to focus on why we're not speaking about transgender individuals, and I'll let or those who are gender fluid. Cyndi, if you don't mind explaining the difference between sexual and affectional orientation and why we've decided to go this route with the discussion.
So I want to be very careful. A lot of times researchers just kind of lump LGBTQ individuals all together without recognizing that sexual affectional orientation has to do with who we love, who we're attracted to, what's going on in terms of those kind of relationships. Transgender has to do with gender identity. And when it comes to gender, there's kind of 4 definitions that are really important to understand as to why we're separating this. There's your biological sex that you're born with, and you know that some people can be intersex. So, and there's gender as defined by society, and often those are in opposition. And then we have gender identity, how we feel inside, and gender expression, how we express ourselves. But our gender, although related, is different from our sexual affectional orientation. And I'm saying affectional orientation because we used to say sexual orientation, and people who were heterosexual always thought that this had to do with sex. But for those who are heterosexual, when you say affectional orientation and you emphasize this is about who we're attracted to, who we want to have these kind of relationships with that are more intimate, or passionate, or however we want to define that, it's not just about the sex. Sometimes it can be, that's fine, but just trying to expand that a little bit. So today we're kind of separating that to understand we're not just lumping gender in with who we're attracted to.
From a counselor's perspective, Cyndi, I mean, obviously there's like the obvious answer to this, right? Like, why talk about healthy relationships? But why, I guess, beyond the obvious, why is it so important that we talk about what healthy may look like to somebody versus maybe someone else? Or what, I guess, like, why is it important from a professional counselor's perspective to focus on exploring healthy relationships?
Well, one of the things I've seen in counseling, and also having been born and raised in a cult, and this is such an excellent question, is that what has been told to us, what has been explored and explained, and even when I teach counseling classes, not cult classes, but counseling classes, there really is only one way that people see relationships. Yeah. That, you know, when I was in my cultic group, it was monogamous and it was heterosexual, and sex was when the male wanted it, and it was patriarchal, and that was seen as a healthy relationship, which to me felt horrible. And I wanted a partner. I wanted one person. I did want a monogamous relationship, but I didn't want a patriarchal, and I was seen as heretical. I was seen as absolutely not. That cannot be. So what we're doing when we're talking about healthy relationships, we're expanding the boundaries. We're expanding the definitions. We're saying there are many ways to see this. It doesn't have to be from just this one way. So when couples or individuals come into counseling having difficulty with relationships, sometimes it can just be how they're defining it, how they're thinking about it, and maybe let's redefine some things. What are you seeing? What are you saying, Ashlen?
Well, that can be really powerful in that I know with my experience, and we'll get into that later on, but when you don't even know what options are available to you, especially after leaving a cultic or high control group where things are so black and white, even sort of redefining some of these terms that you learned about in the cults once you exit, can be very empowering. It can also be confusing and maybe at first a little bit troubling because you're challenging some really intense conditioning and pre-existing notions, but that's part of the experience. When I was, I guess, sort of going through this phase of questioning, when it came to my identity, I cut like all my hair off, and a lot of women in the group had very long hair. You know, it's kind of seen as our glory, our feminine glory. And I was like, just accused, like, well, does that mean you're a lesbian now? And like, as if a lesbian's like the worst thing you can be, like, how horrible, you know, to say it like that. But I think people can just so easily make such strong assumptions And it can be really challenging when you're on the receiving end of said assumptions, because then it doesn't make the questioning process any easier, right? Any easier than it's already very difficult. And so, yeah. And so to kind of be the target of that, unfortunately, while you're questioning, it can be really tough while exiting a high control group.
Oh, absolutely. I wrote down a couple quotes here from some of my my clients. That's what we call them, clients. I don't even know what a healthy relationship looks like coming out of a cult. I see several of my clients have divorced. That's because they married in the cult and they didn't want to continue the relationship because it felt so unhealthy. And is a heterosexual monogamous relationship the only way to do things? Because that's all they've seen. And I love this quote from one of my clients. I love this client. The reward of being straight and having a heterosexual relationship after death doesn't seem that appealing. They were identified as gay, and they're like told to be, they couldn't have any relationships in this earthly life. And they said, don't worry, you'll turn heterosexual when you die. And then you'll get wives, many wives, and you'll love it. And they're like, no, not gonna do that.
That sounds horrible.
Doesn't it?
Yeah.
So maybe that leads to common constructs of what we're moving away from cult kind of behavior. I think a lot of terms we already know, that which we have in the slides, and we may go back to, but these are some of the things that we see as this has been defined as what healthy is. If you look at the doctrines, we were just looking at the common constructs that we were looking at. If we go back to the terms, conversion therapy, and conversion therapy is supposed to convert you from or reparative therapy, repair you from being LGBTQ and repair you into being heterosexual and with the gender that matches your biological sex. The problem is with the research that has been done is it leads to heightened depression, stress, anxiety, and suicidal ideation. I did a study with 25 lesbian, gay, bisexual individuals, and every single one of them attempted suicide and had gone through conversion therapy. And it was because they were not seen and as accepted as a whole individual. They tried everything. They tried prayer, singing, going on missions, marrying a heterosexual person. They tried so many different things, including behavioral therapy, beating themselves, cold baths, all sorts of things. And they just realized that they weren't going to spontaneously change through repentance, and so decided they would rather die, which is just the most horrendous thing than to be who they were. But because of that research, the American Counseling Association, and I know this is very US centric, the American Psychological Association, American Pediatric Association, American Medical Association, all of them, and the White House in 2014, all of these entities put out statements saying, we are against reparative and conversion therapy. This is not how we do this. Also, 17 states in the US have outlawed it, including Utah, surprisingly. And there's also a number of countries that have outlawed it because of what it does to individuals. And that includes Canada, Ireland, New Zealand, Brazil. You can see them on there because of how damaging it is. But these people, and especially these parents, if we go back to this, the church and the cult holds parents responsible, which is why the parents feel so guilty and also press so much for their kids to go through reparative or conversion therapy. Yeah, that's it. I have worked with individuals who have been through reparative therapy, coming to counseling. I call it repairing the repair. And it is so damaging, all the constructs that are in their head of I am not worthy. I will never be, because of how I feel, who I am, who am I attracted to. I will never be okay. And I just want to talk about how these constructs and beliefs are reinforced, which led to a lot of the suicidal ideation, depression I was talking about. there is reparative therapy, confession, repentance, prayer, scripture reading. It was always preached, doing service, modeled by others, told just to marry. This was horrible for those who, you know, you have somebody with same-sex attraction who's told to marry someone who's heterosexual, and then they do, and how horrible it is for this person that they never feel like this is a full relationship. How horrible it is for this person. It's horrible for both of them that they would do that. They're called out, punishment, they have to do penance, disfellowship, excommunicated, shunned, some really horrible things that happen in this reinforcing. And well, how do you think this is going to impact LGBTQA? And you know, we can talk about transgender too, but for a moment. But how is this going to impact them, Ashlen? What do you think? And what harm does it do to relationship health, mental health? What are you thinking?
Well, I think, again, kind of like what I said at the very beginning, is when you are in those all-encompassing totalist environments, you're not even aware of the choices available to you. I know for me, for instance, when I was in the group, when I was in college, when I was questioning, I did not even have the vocabulary to even fit a term to my experience or what I was feeling. Even in college, I was at this college where predominantly those in the group go to, and I did not know anything about bisexual individuals. I did not know about the spectrum of experiences. I didn't have the vocabulary to even put to my experience. And so what the result of that was I didn't come out until later. You know, when you're engrossed in an environment where that is the only model you see, when there's only this heterosexual model, when you notice that, I feel like because that's so obviously modeled, there's a lack of communication, if that makes sense, Cyndi, and correct me if I'm wrong. And I know, like with my research, this communication breakdown can also mean great things with having to do with consent. You may not understand consent and what that looks like. I would love to I want to put a statistic out there from what I found with my research regarding consent. And that is that, you know, I surveyed 99 former members of people who had left groups. And one of my measures was the reproductive autonomy scale. And there was a communication subscale surrounding the topic of consent. And what was just a very disturbing finding was 80.8% of these 99 individuals reported that the cult ideological, theological beliefs or practices never communicated the subject of consent when discussing sexual health and well-being. And in addition to that, 60.6% of respondents reported that they did not feel that they could have disagreed, just simply disagreeing with what the cult leader demanded of their reproductive health. So this can honestly goes to show how much the cults can control even very personal issues in individuals' lives, and ultimately even influence their sexual health and also reproductive health and well-being. It just was such a disturbing finding that 80.8% did not have any sort of concept of consent. And so I think that's really important when we think about, you know, what was modeled and what we saw and how that affected communication as to options and availability, and how a lack of communication can correlate with a lack of consent. Anything to add, Cyndi?
Well, that's so disturbing to me, but that's what I see. That's what I see when I do counseling, and also what I saw in my life growing up, that consent was never talked about. So let's talk about healing. Let's talk about, what does it look like and how do we even start with this whole thing? Ashlen, what do you think?
Well, I certainly, there's a lot to unpack with healing, but I'd be very happy to kind of share my experience in my unique situation after leaving a very conservative group in regards to healing. But, you know, I find that healing comes in stages. Like something may pop up here and there, and then maybe a few years later it comes up again, and there's not one right way to healing, right? It's a spectrum of experiences. And I know for me, the college that I went to, it was like ring by spring. That was like the
Ring by
saying.
spring, have to be married. That was us too. Yeah.
And I did exactly what I was supposed to do. I got the ring. By spring, I got my bachelor's degree, and I was married 3 days after that, because all our friends were still in town before we went our separate ways for graduation. And I was very, very, very fortunate that I married my best friend, because I realized how many people that maybe wasn't the case for. But I was married at 20 years old. Before I could legally purchase alcohol, I was married. And people were giving me horrible unsolicited advice about all things in the bedroom. I'm sure you could probably relate to some of that, Cyndi, just because our backgrounds being similar.
Yes.
It was horrible being a woman in this group. But again, I did exactly what I was supposed to do. However, on our, I believe it was our second or third anniversary of being married, I just was starting to explode at the seams as to trying to figure out who I was. And again, I just didn't really have that vocabulary. Once I was married, I was still in the group for a while, and I was very much so like trying to break out of the submissive housewife role and understand what it meant to be married. And I thought that had to be one thing. And it was very toxic for me. And my partner was just so affirming. It was on our anniversary. He took me out to get a cheeseburger, which I know doesn't sound great for some people on an anniversary. It's exactly what I wanted. Exactly what I wanted. So we got a cheeseburger, and he said, "We really need to talk about your sexuality. We just really need to talk about."
Wow.
And he did it in such a beautiful way that did not make me feel, I was still in tears because I thought it was the end of the world, that I was attracted to women, that, you know, I was experiencing what I was experiencing. That was maybe on our 3rd-year anniversary. And that talk was really hard for me, even though he went about it in such a beautifully delicate way. Fast forward a few years later, I had a life-changing conversation with a dear friend who's a mental health professional. And she said, "Can I ask you something?" And I said, "Sure." And she said, "How are you managing, you know, she was just honestly curious, being bisexual, being married, getting married to someone when we both left the group together." Our situation was certainly unique. I had never dated anyone while I was in the group. And I mean, before, who was of the same sex, before marriage or anything like that. She just was like, "I'm just curious." Like, and I said, "Honestly, I'm not. Honestly, I don't know how. And I'm really scared to talk about this." And my partner was with me, and we were talking to her, and he said, "You know, I've always been supportive of Ashlen. I want her to do whatever she wants." And that was life-changing. And again, I realized that that's not everyone's situation, so I want to be sensitive to that. And I'm just kind of sharing one of my perspectives of this is how I sort of began my healing process. But what was really impactful was she said, "You know, have you ever considered polyamory? Have you ever considered, like, there's so many other things?" And my head was just exploding, because I got started in my early career helping women leaving abusive polygamous situations, you know, out in Utah. So I was like, of course I never considered, you know, I equated even consensual polyamory. I think in my mind, I had to really break that down, because I had seen really abusive, religiously fueled polygamy and what it can do to women. And so that was really disturbing. So I really had to break that down. And she said, have you guys ever considered like you guys never had the chance to just like date people, to just like go and like figure it out? And I was just like petrified. And it took about a good year or two after that conversation. So it kind of came in phases over the past several years. And I got to a place finally where I wasn't afraid that my partner was going to leave me if I actually started living my sexuality, and doing what I needed to do. And in fact, when I was in a relationship for a short period of time with somebody, my partner experienced great compersion. And that's a term that, do you know of that term, Cyndi? Have you ever heard of compersion?
No, please share.
Yeah, compersion is a term that it's what people say is it's like the opposite of jealousy. He saw how fulfilled I was, and happy I was having a female relationship in my life, how complete I felt to have my sort of nesting partner, so to speak, my best friend, and someone who was a female. And he was just so happy. He was just so joyful.
I'm writing this word down. I love this.
Yeah, compersion. And I realize, again, that's not everyone's experience. Some people may be more prone to jealousy. There's not right or wrong way, to go about these things. But, we're in a safe space in our relationship now. My partner and I was talking to Cyndi actually before we started recording, but I love this term, relationship anarchy. That's something that I've come across in exploring these subjects and topics. And relationship anarchy is it's really for ultimately doing what's best for you. You still have boundaries. You still communicate what you want out of relationships, but it's not within the confines of what society has expected. And
so I want to discuss this for just a minute in terms of defining a healthy relationship. And you get to define a healthy relationship with your partner together, or partners. And Sternberg made this lovely little chart. He said there's 3 parts of a relationship. It's intimacy, connection. There's commitment, where you both are together, like the monogamous relationship. And there's passion, which is the sexuality. And he called the intersection of each one, different words, companionate love, romantic love, fatuous love. And he talked about how the middle intersection of all 3 is consummate love, and how we all need to be moving in these heterosexual relationships towards consummate love. The interesting thing is that this chart, these 3 areas, intimacy, commitment, and passion, it has evolved into create your own relationship. We don't have to all move towards consummate love. We can create our relationship in terms of liking and friendship. It sounds like, Ashlen, you married your best friend, but having another female companion who you can have those kind of connections with is really important, or it was at that time. So you can define that. How much commitment is there? Is this a monogamous relationship? Is this a polyamorous relationship? There's still boundaries. And then sex, passion. How are you going to define that at different times? What works for your relationship? So as you look at defining your own relationships, what works for you and your partner or partners? It doesn't have to look the same as what was originally defined. And I love that this started as there's only one way, you have to have all 3, to what works for you? What's best for you? Where are you happiest? What do you think?
And there's a lot of fluidity as well in that, like, for example, you may not feel comfortable in labeling your relationship as a polyamorous one, and that's totally fine. And, but yet you can still be open to what your relationship may look like a few years from now may not look like how it is now, and I think that's sort of the beauty in this fluidity, where labels can be very, very helpful. And also, like, you also don't have to use them, at the same time.
Right, exactly.
This can be a fluid thing. Yeah. And there's just no right way. There's just no one right way. There's many ways, and exploration should be fun. And unfortunately for me, it was very, very stressful, and it is for a lot of people.
Well, and I love that you use the word fluidity. I actually use this chart with my clients. I'll say, I'll talk about each area and where do you see yourselves right now and where do you want to be? And it really is exploration. It's all about exploration. It isn't trying to fit a square peg in a round hole. It is whatever works for you, as long as you're happy and feel your boundaries are being respected. And what works for you today doesn't have to work a couple of years down the line or even tomorrow. It's being able to explore and not having, this is what we need to be at all times. So it's really important to have those discussions with your partners. And if you have a therapist, feeling comfortable to have these exploration discussions.
There's kind of this queer imposter syndrome that I think a lot of us feel after, I'm making a generalization by a lot of us feel, but when you've left a high control group, maybe you get married very young, or maybe you get married before that exploration phase, and maybe you didn't understand your options. But I know for me, it was, how can I be a bisexual woman in a married relationship with a man? And there was like how can both of those things exist? And they can exist simultaneously in different ways. And for a long time, I had this queer imposter syndrome, so to speak. And it was like, am I queer enough because I'm in this traditionally very heterosexual presenting relationship? But like, our relationship is actually not a traditional heterosexual relationship. So I just feel like that's really important to mention is you are queer enough. If you're listening to this and you are questioning, am I queer enough because I'm in this situation after leaving XYZ group, you are absolutely queer enough just the way you are. And, I just want to dismiss any of those feelings of feeling like we're imposters in the LGBTQ community.
Said about, yes, you're queer enough. Yes, I just love what you say, Ashlen. I could just sit here and listen to you all day.
You're like, oh, no, I really appreciate the work you do, Cyndi, honestly. And I know we're pressed for time, and so I'm really excited to see what we get into with the Q&A. We're very happy to answer any of your questions.
Sounds great. Thank you.